Our guest today is Vanessa Kredler. She's a registered counsellor and psychotherapist who specialises in addiction and complex trauma. Vanessa has a master's in counselling and is a certified food addiction counsellor. She takes a holistic, trauma-informed and person-centered approach to therapy. Influenced by her own recovery journey, Vanessa champions the principle of do your own work, continuously evolving both professionally and personally. Vanessa is also a passionate advocate, collaborating with organisations such as Sane Australia and the Blue Knot Foundation to challenge the stigma surrounding food addiction and trauma. Vanessa, it's an honour to have you here on Beyond Turning Points. Welcome.
Thank you, Ash. It's an honour here for me as well.
Now, truly wonderful to have you here. And we met only recently, probably 5 weeks ago, I think, maybe at Bronte. So Brett Chernin, who's been on the podcast before, and we had a chat around men's work. And he runs a meditation called The Sit, which is every Saturday morning on Bronte Beach in Sydney. And we met on a cold, windy morning and had a great chat. And here we are now. So as I do on Beyond Turning Points, we just kind of jump straight in and use the turning point as the focal point for the interview, and then we expand from there. So would you be happy to share your turning point with myself and the guests?
Absolutely, I'd love to. Yeah. It's a real honor. So my turning point centers around food addiction. Maybe I should sort of say what that is, because, even though it sort of sounds very obvious to me, some people, often say to me, well, what is that? Aren't we all addicted to food, right? And so food addiction is an addiction which is currently not recognized officially in the DSM. So it means it can't really be diagnosed, even though you can self-diagnose, of course. And it's basically when you're constantly eating too much, despite knowing that there are dire consequences to your health, and always being preoccupied with food and being preoccupied with weight quite often too. And then really trying to cut back, but not being able to. So it's like a real kind of addiction, like trying to not do it and to do it anyway all the time. And then what happens is, because you're in that cycle, you sort of feel really horrible about yourself, very guilty and ashamed about your behavior. And often people do it in secret because they're so ashamed of not being able to control their food. So that's what food addiction is. And so my turning point. So I'll probably share first how that all started for me, because before I can go into the turning point as to how the recovery happened. So it's a really awful story. Like, I actually have always struggled with food, like my whole life. I don't ever remember it to be different for me. So even when I was really little, I remember that I always just wanted to eat more. And whenever there was, food served up at home for every meal, I would just sort of tuck in and like scan everybody else's plate and go for more. And it was just something that I was just really keen on doing and loved it. And it wasn't really a big deal in my childhood. It was just kind of normal. I didn't think anything of it. Nobody said anything. And so I was just kind of the kid that was always after everybody else's sweets, and sort of I knew all the spots in the house, where you can find the treats. And it was in my young teenage years, like I think I would have been 11 or so, when somebody said, it was a family member, and also then other people, at school and stuff, they said, if you don't watch what you eat or how much you eat, you're gonna get fat. And I remember that sort of, that sort of message. And at that point is when the wars in my head started, because it was like, oh my God, I really need to eat. Like, I couldn't not eat and not overeat. But I also knew that it was dangerous or not good to overeat. And so I tried to then, I got into sort of like eating disordered behavior, trying to sort of control my eating, to starve myself, and then I would binge even more after those starving episodes. And so I turned into sort of, yeah, one of those teenagers. There are so many, who are struggling with this, and who really developed kind of like an eating disorder on top of that food addiction, which was always present. Um, yeah, and so I it just got worse and worse basically throughout my teenage years. And it was just a part of me. Like I just kind of had always every day of my life, I was kind of like, next week or tomorrow on Monday, it's going to be different. I'm not going to eat that much. I'm going to be careful about what I eat. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to look amazing once I've lost X amounts of kilos. All of that stuff was playing in my head. And that just continued like in my 20s, in my 30s. And I noticed that, there were periods in my food addiction where it was worse than other times. And I know now that those periods were usually when I was in some sort of emotional upheaval, or, there was a big change in my life, like, yeah, whatever change. And there was a time when it got really bad, which is when I was in my early 30s. And at that period in my life, a lot of things changed at the same time. Like I left a big relationship. I changed countries. So I'm from Germany. I moved to France, took on a new big job, and everything was big, and big and new and quite overwhelming. And so I ended up just binging my brains out, and just couldn't stop. And I was just going from one sort of, shop to the next, and just savoring all these French delights. I was in Paris, which is not a great place for a food addict. And so, at some point I was just so distraught, not only with my rapid weight gain, but also with this insanity in my mind, because what is a really destructive kind of characteristic of any addiction, but particularly in my case, food addiction, is the relentless obsession around it every second of the day. So it's kind of like, from getting up to going to bed, it's all about, what am I going to eat? Where am I going to get this from? What am I going to eat after that? Oh no, I shouldn't be eating. I've got to stop this. And this constant war in my head, and always being preoccupied with that sort of dialogue inside. Yeah, and then eventually it got so bad. I got so worried about my mental health, that I went to a counselor. I found an English-speaking counselor in France, in Paris, and we did a little bit of work. And then she sent me to a 12-step program, and that's where my recovery started, basically. Um, but the turning point hasn't come yet. So I sort of was in that recovery program for, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so. And I was getting a fair bit of healing from just being around people who were understanding me. So that there was a lot of shame that got removed through that process, because, when you're with people who really get it, because they've got the same issue, it's just really quite liberating. Um, and so I was doing much better in that respect, but I was still binging, and I was still obsessing about food. And I spent like 5 years in that program, and also doing counseling and various different, modalities, to try and work out, what should I eat? Like, how should I manage this? Like, I can't, I tried so many things. And so in this program, they talked about, you just try to eat 3 moderate meals a day. But I didn't know what moderate was. And I couldn't understand how to moderate my food. And then some people said, well, you don't eat sugar, or you don't eat flour, because those are the most addictive things. And so I just sort of found my way with lots of trial and error. But to be honest, I was still really struggling with the practicalities of the food. And then I remember one day, I was I was so desperate. Like it was sort of like I thought I'd already hit my bottom, but I hadn't. Like I was just going really insane, and I was in that state where I was so afraid of letting go of my compulsive eating. Like I just couldn't imagine to live without that excess food, which I was kind of, consuming in whatever possible ways I could, even though I was in recovery, sort of, Um, and on the other hand, I had this massive fear of continuing that. So it was like this bind. Like I didn't know where to go with that. I was completely stuck and terrified of, like, what am I going to eat next? Like, how is this going to work? I just couldn't see a way forward at all. And I remember being in one of those 12-step meetings in my group, and I burst into tears. And then a woman came forward who became my sponsor. So in the 12 steps, we have sponsors, which is kind of like a mentor, right? Somebody who's a peer, but they're a little bit further in their recovery than you are. And so that's how we support each other. And so she basically she kind of took me under her wing, and she said, she was quite tough love. And she said, I'm going to give you a food plan, and you just eat to that food plan, and you tell me exactly what you're going to eat every day. And that's it. And you're not going to veer off that food plan, like no matter what. And so she gave me this food plan, and it was weighed and measured. Like, it was like, you've got to measure everything that you eat and tell her exactly what you're going to eat every day. And I had already tried lots of different food plans, so that wasn't news to me, but the weighing and measuring was a new thing for me. And it was also that sort of tough love approach of, you're gonna call me every day and tell me what you're gonna eat. And I was like, oh, okay. And to be honest, in retrospect, I really needed that. I needed that direction. I needed somebody to pull me out of that hole, because I just had no I was so at my wit's end with this. And yeah, so I remember the day that I started this food plan, and I was quite terrified of starting, because I was afraid of, am I going to gain more weight on this? Because I had just changed, I just started another sort of diet or whatever, because I was constantly trying on new diets and whatnot. And how am I going to live without my snack before bed, and all these things which sound so trivial to a normal eater, but for me that was like the most terrifying thing. I was like really, really addicted. And I remember going to bed. So I ate to the plan, and I told her what I was going to eat, and then I went to bed, and I was just really terrified of not eating that snack, and couldn't sleep for ages. But eventually I got to sleep, and the next day I woke up, and for the first time in my life, I had no obsession about food. It was gone.
Hmm.
And that's the turning point, because I was like, wow, like I was so free. I mean, I had my usual anxiety. I was definitely still, thinking about, okay, what am I going to eat? How am I going to organize my food? Because I knew that I had to stick to this plan and give her a call and tell her what I was going to eat and all of those things. But my mind was free, and I had all this space in my mind, and I was really present. And yeah, that's continued. Like I still have a food plan. And I remember in that early recovery period that I spoke to this person or emailed her my food for 2 years every day in a row, like every day. And I still have a food plan, but I don't, I sort of, it's shifted and changed over time. But what has stayed with me is the freedom of mind. And now when, sometimes, I talk to people, and in conversation it comes up, and I say, my most prized possession in the world is having that mental freedom from obsession. So yeah, that's the turning point, basically.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So what do you find having that mental freedom gives you?
Oh God, that's an amazing question. Um, it's like it just gives me a lot of gratitude. Like it's so incomprehensible, I suppose, to a person who doesn't have that constant obsession. But for people who do have a constant obsession, be it food or something else, right? It is such a prison. It's like it's so undescribable. It's like you can function, right? But you've always got something running, which actually preoccupies most of your mind, but you can still function. You can still sort of split off a part of you and kind of still get on with things, but you're not really there. And so not having that is like, it's like I can be myself. I could, that was sort of almost a prerequisite of discovering myself and really then going deeper into my healing, because back up until that point there was no way that I could have done any deeper work or anything like that, because I was so preoccupied all the time.
Mm-hmm. And what did you discover about yourself when you went deeper? I'm really curious. Like, what was
Oh
there
God.
once you took away that
Mm.
preoccupation with food?
Yeah, I mean, that's really when my recovery started in earnest. And I mean, this is now 15 years ago. So a lot has happened in that time, and a lot of turning points have happened as well. But if I had to summarize, I suppose I would say that I kind of took a journey, which is ongoing, which is that, over time in recovery, I discovered other addictions, so it's like I learned that, oh, okay, so it's not only the food, it's actually that I've got an addictive sort of system or process going, and that can pop up in all areas of my life, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I can find myself, noticing that, so the way I work, the way I do relationships, the way I spend money, even the way that I listen to music can be like really addictive. I can listen to the way I still now, right? The way I listen to music is I find a new tune, like I'm a huge techno fan, so I'll find a new track and I listen to it until it's dead and then I chuck it away kind of thing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's a very addictive kind of way of doing things. And so I can find myself over or underdoing all kinds of things in my life. And so that was a massive turning point, that has led me to other sort of streams of 12-step recovery and other sort of modalities to seek, recovery and healing from that. But ultimately, that real kind of understanding about myself that I will always have this addictive kind of nature or tendency or brain,
Mm-hmm.
and that I'll always have to be on my toes about that. And now I sort of see it, I've kind of reframed it, or I sort of experience it as a bit of a, in many ways it's a superpower, but in many ways it's
Mm-hmm.
also a bit of a liability. So it's always like, how do you keep the balance? Like it really keeps you on your toes, basically.
Yeah. And do you think, you don't have to answer this, but do you think that it was an innate system that was in you, or do you think it was brought in through conditioning or experiences when you were younger?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, addiction is my favorite topic in the world, so
Mm.
I love the question. I think it's both in my case, and it's different for everyone. But in my case, I believe that I was born with it because I could never remember being in any other way. I also know that my ancestors have had some real kind of sort of trauma that I believe I might have taken on. There's kind of
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit of evidence for that in my history. But I also know that from my early childhood, there were traumas which we would call, we'd call it complex trauma or attachment trauma, that sort of trauma, which kind of, arises from relational, kind of ongoing kind of relational trauma or misattunement. And that would have led to my addiction for sure. So to like you, my short answer would be it's both for me, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I often think about, that perspective that we only do things if there's benefits. And
Mm.
then when the benefits outweigh, when whatever the opposite word I'm looking for of
Mhm.
benefits, I'm sure people listening are saying it's this word, so thank you. The So you hit, there's a point where there's beneficial things happening. And
Mhm.
I guess what's that? Can't remember who shared this definition, but it was addiction is taking something that almost works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so So there's benefits, but then it gets to a point where it's actually not benefit, it's taking away. But then it sounds like, you know, and for a lot of people, and that you've described, was that the awareness was there, this isn't beneficial to me, but it took a long time for the operating system, being the, you know, how you operate in the world, to catch up.
Absolutely. It's exactly that. You know, people say it often in terms of, you know, like addiction. I mean, the reason why we do it is because it does work. I mean, food is a really regulating substance just as much as for other people. You know, it's alcohol or different drugs or different, you know, I don't know, spending money or whatever it is. And yeah, I mean, it worked for a really long time until the consequences of the behavior, which is quite extreme, and it gets more and more extreme the more the brain sort of adapts to the behavior, right? And the more extreme the behavior got, the more extreme the consequences got, which then kind of then suddenly it flips the other way, and it's like this real kind of liability where you sort of go, oh my God, you know, if I keep doing this, I'm going to get myself into real trouble, either through health or, you know, in terms of when people take drugs or alcohol, it can also have serious implications on their external life in terms of you know, I don't know, they might do something criminal, right? Or get themselves into a car accident or all kinds of things, right? So yeah, it can be it can be really dangerous addiction in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a powerful question to ask. What will happen if I keep doing what I'm doing?
Oh, that's right. Absolutely. I mean, I remember two really embarrassing and distinctly scary moments in the height of my food addiction, which was that so one of them was, now this is embarrassing, but I do share it because I think, you know, sometimes it helps people, I hope, to listen to how ridiculous my behavior was. um so once, so what I did at some point have these strategies where, so I was binging quite a bit, and to control my weight, I would then go off to book myself into these expensive like juice fast retreats, you know, these sort of like kind of lovely yoga-y type things, you know, that you can do. And so my digestive system was really messed up. And once I remember coming off a juice fast, which was, I don't know, maybe a week long or so, and they instructed, of course, they would instruct you to start eating slowly and, you know, not eat, you know, eat certain soft foods for a while and sort of, you know, get back into the groove. And of course, I had a binge straight away, and I ended up developing an impaction, which meant that I basically had to, after about 5 days or so, I had to take myself to hospital and be sort of unblocked, so to speak, to, you know, to because my digestion was completely messed up. And then another moment was I was in I was at home and I wasn't keeping any food at home. I was eating I would go shopping for each meal separately for fear of binging on anything that was in my home. This is how crazy it was. And so what I did have at home, so this was in the middle of the night, there was nothing at home, but I felt like a binge. And I had this dried couscous package in my pantry. And so I started spooning this couscous, but it's dry. And normally, you know, you pour water on it to make it all expand, right? And of course, what happened, you know, somehow, of course, you know, it sort of started expanding. And I had this, I nearly choked myself to death that night. And I mean, I can give you some more examples like that. I won't, but basically saying, you know, like it's so dangerous. And I live with consequences to my health still today in terms of, you know, digestive issues and hormonal issues which come from this time of extreme behavior that will always be with me because of that behavior.
And how do you relate to that now when that's happening? So because, you know, there's consequences from the past, and then when you're aware of those, how do you relate to that?
Yeah, like I suppose you're kind of asking something along the lines of, is there regret or something like that?
Possibly. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
that could be one of the things that's there. I
Yeah.
just curious around what happens. Is there self-compassion? Is there just the
Yeah.
acknowledgement? And, you know, I'm making the assumption too that it equips you better to work with people with
Yeah.
addictions.
No, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. How is it? It's sort of like I've accepted it. I've done a fair bit of work around it. So there's no, uh, no, there's no regret as such. It's sort of like there is self-compassion about it. But it's sort of like looking back at this younger version of me and sort of thinking, you know, with a sort of tender heart, sort of almost sort of thinking, wow, what pain I was in, you know, and what turmoil I was in, and how shocking it is that we do these things to ourselves because there is such a desperate need for maintaining the behavior, because it obviously in some way wanted to keep us safe, right, and regulated or soothed or whatever. You know how desperate I was to keep that, all of that alive, despite knowing how, and totally disregarding how bad that was for my body.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's like, it's almost like there is self-compassion and tenderness, and there is also a lot of like almost like stepping back and going, wow, like if I saw myself in a movie doing that, it's a bit of a shock, really, you know.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and that makes sense. You know, the further we get away from that past version of ourselves, the harder it is to relate or to actually experience that moment as that
Mm.
version of ourselves. I have
Mm.
this thing that I do sometimes when I'm thinking about the past and, you know, a past version of me that I'm not so proud of or that was really suffering. And it, you know, it's like a quantum idea, right? Where the present version of me can send back insight to the past version of me.
Yeah.
And one of the things I had was, there was one point, you know, I'd had PTSD and was very, very unwell, and life was very, very hard. And I was on medication and I went off it because it wasn't working for me. And I had this voice, you know, as well as a partner at the time, but this voice, it just kept saying, go natural, you're going to find a way. And so often what I would do is, as I got further away from that version of myself, I would be sending that message back to
Mm.
myself and be
Mhm.
like, okay, go natural, stick with it, you're going to find a way. And it was this
Yeah.
really clear voice that came through in that past version of myself.
Yeah, I'd 100% relate to that. Um, I've got two sort of modalities that have helped me a lot with that, which exactly are this what you're describing. So the first one is that in the 12 steps, we learn to uh, develop a relationship with a higher power. So whatever that is, right? It doesn't have to be religious. But so I was sort of luckily, I always had something like that somewhere tucked away, but it sort of went dormant, and then it came back when I was, you know, in my 12-step. Like I really kind of relearned that to make that connection to what I call spirit, but you know, they call it a higher power. And so that voice is sort of like what I now kind of draw on a lot in terms of getting that inner guidance to put me back onto the path when I need it, or even it just comes, right? Like it just comes, like as you're describing, and it's very clear and usually very brief in its messages and very sort of unambiguous. So that's one. But the other modality that I use a lot, which is also very related, is internal family systems, IFS, and I use that both in my own therapy as a client, but also with clients that I work with, and um, it's basically part of the protocol of IFS is that you, as in yourself, goes back in time to parts that have been exiled by, you know, in your system, so to speak, of parts, and you basically help them in a situation. You do what we call a do-over or a redo of a kind of traumatic memory, and you then eventually bring them back into the present. But it's the same kind of thing of connecting the present to the past and building that bridge.
Mm-hmm. So connecting the present to the past, building the bridge, and you might have said it. So there's the bins were getting collected outside and it was quite noisy at my end.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's the bridge between the past and the present?
Yeah, so it's like what you do in internal family systems is like you basically develop a relationship between yourself. So basically, IFS, it basically says there is a self, right, which is kind of like almost like an innate kind of higher, I don't know, entity that we all have, that we all are basically, but we also all have lots of parts, and that's very normal and natural, right? But what happens is that sometimes our parts can take on extreme roles and behaviors. Like, for example, my binging part, that would be doing all the binging, and then what comes in on the other side is a restricting part that wants to do all the starving. And so, they sort of work against each other and it can get quite extreme. And usually those parts are, we call them protectors, and they protect something vulnerable. And so eventually, once we get to know those protector parts, which, takes time and, it's a whole process, but once we kind of go to the vulnerable parts of us that they're protecting, we usually find that they're stuck in the past and they're somehow sort of stuck in a horrible I don't know, some sort of a trauma or a horrible situation. They're feeling awful and they don't want to, they're kind of just stuck there. And so what we do is, as ourself, we develop a relationship with those parts, and eventually we go back there and we help them out in that situation. So maybe it's easier with an example. So say, for example, I've got lots of examples because I've done this therapy for years and it's wonderful. It's just amazing. So I had once, and this is not related to addiction, but I had a young part of me that was kind of disregarded a lot and sort of not really consulted and not really listened to and kind of invisible. And it always felt a bit like they're just doing things to me, but they're not kind of consulting with me. I'm like this little kid, without anyone sort of really accepting me or listening. And so I then, in the therapy session, I went back. The question was always like, well, what did she want? Like, what did she really need at that time? What did she want? So let's ask her. And she goes, this is my little part, right? She goes, well, I want them to listen. So in that moment, I as self go back in there into that memory. This literally happens in my mind while I've got my eyes closed and I'm with my therapist, right? And we just redo the scene. And she says, I want you to talk to him and tell him, no, we're not going to do that. So I do that in the scene. And then once that's done and the little girl is happy, we take her out of there and we bring her into the present. So she kind of integrates back into my system, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So the part that wasn't listened to or consulted, and then you go back, you spend time with that part, you hear what that part needed, and then it's like you bring that back to the present so you can integrate it into, so that part becomes a functional part that's not impacting all the other parts.
Exactly. It just becomes reintegrated, and it's like in other sort of therapy modalities, we talk about and what is it called? A corrective emotional experience, right? And in IFS particularly, we do that through self. So it's not like a therapist or whatever. It's just yourself goes back there, is with that part, and gives that part what it needed, what she needed. And it's just such a wonderful experience, because most addictions and most cases of complex trauma, in my experience, come from some sort of an attachment wounding, right? At its most basic level, right? I mean, you can put a lot of words around it, but basically it's about connection and the rupture of connection. And so in this form of therapy, what you're doing is you're restoring connection internally. So you're creating what's it called? Secure attachment between yourself and all of your parts. So that is the most secure you can ever get, because you don't need anyone else for it. Not that we would say that, oh, you never need any other person. That's not what we want. But of course we want to connect to others. That's very important. But it's an inside job, if that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm. And so then the secure attachment between the parts to the self, that does that create greater freedom? Which you mentioned earlier, is it that benefits there?
Yeah, it does. I mean, for me personally, it was a separate, so the, sort of really gaining that freedom from the food addiction, from the obsession, didn't come through IFS, but it could. Absolutely, it could. And so what I've experienced in my personal therapy through IFS, because I spent years and years in the 12 steps before I even went into IFS therapy. And what I've certainly experienced in terms of the effects is that, yeah, whenever I have what we call an unburdening, which is basically the process of you bring the part back into the present and the part unburdens all its kind of, shit from the past and we bring it back, right? It's like I usually feel I feel a lot more freedom. I often feel taller, like I've literally grown up, which is amazing. I don't know how that works. And I feel it. Sometimes there are somatic shifts, which are, I don't know how to explain them, but they're like just something shifts in the body and some tension releases in some way. And yeah, there is a lot of greater freedom of mind and of sort of emotion or sensation, but also behavior changes. So again, I'm just drawing on my own experience, but one experience, one change, one shift in behavior that I can really see in myself through this therapy is that I used to have a very strong people-pleasing part that was very submissive and quite compliant. And because of my trauma history of being with very critical people, who were always telling me off kind of thing. Or disregarding
People
me.
pleasers, raise your hand
Yeah,
if you're
that's
listening.
right. People
Raise your
pleasers,
hand if you're
exactly.
listening.
Right.
We're with you.
In addiction terms, it's called codependency, but people pleasing is one of those, much better words, I think. And so I used to have a very strong part like that, and that part is not gone, but it's so much more relaxed, and I can be very assertive now, and I can be very I know my no, I know how to say no, I've got really great boundaries, and that's because I've worked with my parts around kind of healing their fears of almost like standing up for them and helping them to stand up for themselves in the past, and kind of rewriting those memories, so to speak, inside. So yeah, that's a massive behavior shift for me.
Yeah. I actually have sitting here on my desk, I've got Richard Schwartz, who developed internal family systems. I've got his book, No Bad Parts, and also a workbook that goes with it. So
wonderful.
For people that are listening, I'll put a link in the show notes to those books in case you want to learn more about internal family systems.
Great.
Are you happy if we have if we use myself as a case study? That doesn't have to be a therapy session, but I have this, and there's shame there too, which, and I'm not sure is it an addiction or is it just a bad eating pattern, right? And I think, a lot of people will probably be able to connect with this, and it's sugar, right? And it's almost like once a day, I feel like I need to get the sugar hit. And if I haven't got the sugar hit, I'll go for a walk in the evening to the shop and get something sugary. And, when I say sugary, it's vegan, it's unprocessed sugars, like, it's quite healthy, but there's still this little piece that's there. And I go, am I rewarding myself? Am I doing this for a reward? I don't think so, but it's like this little behavior that keeps coming up daily. Got anything on that?
I relate to that so well. first of all, I think that addiction it comes on a spectrum, right? And so
Mhm.
I would be one of those people who's off the spectrum. I've got such a strong, severe addiction. But many people, probably most people, are sort of maybe on the kind of lower end, and they've got these types of addictions. Same with coffee, right?
Mhm.
Chocolate, people, sugar is a massive one, right? So I'd say there's two things to that. One of them is that um, it's simply a fact that sugar is an addictive processed substance. It's not really food. You don't need it in your
Mhm.
diet, right? And it's highly addictive, and foods are ultra processed foods are created so that they are made addictive. It's just the whole food industry is built in that way. And so the brain will respond in a way that makes you go to the shop and get your fix, so to speak, right? So that's one. So that's the sort of physiology of addiction, right?
Mhm.
Which I don't know if you know this wonderful researcher called Anna Lemke. She wrote a book about addiction called Dopamine Nation.
Right. I've
And
heard of the book. Not
yeah,
her name, but I've heard of the book.
it's excellent. And
Mhm.
so the reason why I'm mentioning that is because, she basically says that in today's age, everything is created to be so addictive that anyone can get addicted. It doesn't need someone like me who's had like a trauma story or whatever. Just anyone can get addicted simply because things are designed to be so addictive, and they're so readily available in abundance and in excess that we would all easily get addicted, right?
Mm.
So that I would say is that's just a sort of habit, right?
Mhm.
Where you just sort of get hooked on it, and you just continue that habit. But then the question is, and this is with regards to IFS, right?
Mhm.
There is a part of you, right, that won't want to do without that fix, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
And so the coolest question in IFS is, what is that part afraid would happen if you didn't get that fixed? Right.
Mm.
And I could ask you directly. I could say, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't get that fixed? What would be your answer? Just like that.
Yeah. Well, what came to mind was discomfort. There will be discomfort. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, most of
Mm-hmm.
our lives, mine included, geared to avoid discomfort to some level. And that,
Mm-hmm.
the mindfulness and meditation helps the capacity to be with discomfort. But,
Mm-hmm.
there's, I have guitars on the wall, so I don't have to get them out of the guitar case,
Mm-hmm.
creating something. And also what came to mind was Dave Asprey's got a book called Smarter, Not Harder. And,
Ah,
he refers to our bodies as a meat suit, and that we're
mm-hmm.
hardwired to be lazy.
Yes.
Yeah. And to seek resources and put them into our body.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so coming back to your question, what would happen if I didn't have that? There would be a sense of discomfort and a sugar craving
Mm-hmm.
that would be uncomfortable and start to overtake my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I relate to that so much because someone else, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, we do things as humans, we do things for two reasons. It's either to avoid pain or to go towards pleasure, right? So
Mhm.
it's like that's the only two things that we ever do as humans. It's very normal, very biological.
Mm.
Um, and for good reason. But it's interesting, that whole thing about discomfort, because then, the next question would be, and then what? So what if you're uncomfortable, right? And then what? So if you keep asking, and then what? You can very quickly get to the source of, you know, then what would happen? What would happen if you
Yeah.
were uncomfortable, right?
Well, I already played that out in my mind, so I'll share it. So I went, okay, I'll be uncomfortable, and then what I find happens with sugar is the intensity of wanting sugar increases, and then
Mm-hmm.
I experience sort of cold-like, flu-like symptoms, runny nose, feel foggy in the head,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. And that's the phase that I don't want to go through, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
because,
Mm-hmm.
and I know it's a sort of a 3 to 5 day process. Generally for me, it's about 5 days. And
Mm-hmm.
then when I get out the other side, it's like, okay, I'm not craving sugar so much. But then I observe that the cravings come back, and it creeps back in. I'll just have this today, and then I don't have anything the next day, but then that day after that, and then it becomes daily, and then there's this. I rarely ever surrender to the gorging on sugar.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? But generally what will happen is, if it gets to the point where I'm going to eat half a block of chocolate, that's my limit. I'm like, okay, this sugar thing's getting ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it becomes that unmindful, just shoving it in, and it's gone. And then why did I do that?
Yeah. It's so amazing to hear you talk about this, because you know, I hear this all the time from clients, and I know this experience as well, right? The cravings are so overpowering that it's like I mean, that's withdrawal, right? And in food addiction recovery, we talk about withdrawal just as much as you talk about withdrawal from alcohol or drugs. It's a similar process. I mean, it's very painful. You get all kinds of physical symptoms, and it's really quite horrible, and it makes you not function well. That's an understatement, right? In many cases, it can be really extreme. And so the brain literally kind of will feed you, like, it's so queued up. Like, as soon as you walk past a cafe and you smell something, or you see something, or somebody says, oh, I'm going to get like one of those vegan, I don't know, bliss balls or whatever they're called,
Yeah, I think that's
and
my
it's like,
addiction.
yeah, and then you just go for it, because you'll just, in that moment, you'll find that little part of you that's sort of adjusted to the brain chemistry that's going. It's sort of, it'll go, oh yeah, well, it'll start justifying. It'll start going, well, yeah, because if he does it, then I'll go as well, right? Or if because it's Tuesday, or because it's Friday, or because I've had such a hard time at work, it'll find any reason for collaborating with the craving, so to speak, and get you to have that sugar. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
amazing.
so manipulative, the mind, when it gets triggered to have a substance that we're craving, and the amount of different reasons it'll come. Oh, you worked really hard, or oh, it's Friday. It's I guess I must be saying my own ones. But yeah, I always find it interesting when I'm connected into what that voice is saying, how manipulative and how much it perseveres. So if I use the example of sugar, for those 5 days, how much it perseveres to. And I know with my thinking, it's like, well, I may as well just have a little bit of sugar so the craving doesn't get amplified, and that there's greater discomfort. So each day I'll just have a little bit. I'll just have a little bit. But then, of course, sugar being sugar, and my body being the way it is, my brain being the way it is, it wants more and more and more. And so over time it steps up until I get to this point where it's like, it's getting too much.
That's right. So what you're describing sounds like, I don't want to minimize it, but it sounds like a mild thing, right? Like compared to, say, somebody who's like, they're so so I suppose what we say with addiction is it's kind of like, can I live with it, kind of, right? Or to what extent does it completely overpower my life to the point that I can't function anymore, right? So this is the kind of trade-off that people need to decide for themselves. But the general kind of I suppose, recommendation for people with, addiction is, none is easier than some, right? So it's like, I mean, I have to abstain from sugar, for example. There's no way, I just cannot for the life of me. If I had sugar, that's it, I'm gone. Like I will not stop. And it can be so serious. And so I suppose there is that sort of decision that people have to make in terms of, and it's very hard for clients, right? Because there are people who are not as addicted, and they'll be like, how much sugar can I get away with, kind of thing? Can I just have a little bit, because I don't really want to give up all of it, kind of thing, right? And so ultimately you've got to live with that sort of decision about, you know, do I want peace of mind? Because then I just let go of it completely. And then
Yeah.
the cravings eventually will go away.
Mm.
Um, and then you'll be free of it, right? But a lot of people don't want to do that, or maybe you don't need to do that necessarily, right? Um, but the other thing I would say is for those who want to do that, because you're describing that period, right? The 5 days where it's like really
Mhm.
hard and the voice is kind of, it keeps coming at you. And it's it's that time when we say you need daily support, and it's where people go to groups, or you know, there's like, I don't know, nowadays there's so many great, like even Facebook groups and things like that, where you can get sort of that daily interaction with others who are on the same journey. Because if there's one thing I learned in all of these lessons that I learned in my addiction recovery, is like, you can't do it on your own. Don't do it. For anyone who's listening, don't do it on your own. um it's just so hard, and
Mm.
it's so awful to do it in your own little world and try and not succeed and feel like you're a failure and having all that shame and everything. um but yeah, it's very difficult to break addictions, right? That's why they're addictions. They're so hard to break.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very interesting around the isolation, and that the inner critic, when it's
Mm.
isolated, it becomes very, very, very powerful when we don't have people to reflect off and have people
Yeah.
go, oh, actually, you're really good at X, you know,
Mhm.
or I really enjoyed your singing. It's beautiful singing. Oh, really? Because my inner critic was hammering me. And I
Amazing.
find that with, you know, when people are isolated, the inner critic just turns up and up and up.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
mm,
absolutely. It's like, yeah, the inner critic can be so vicious. And I remember, so I've got a whole system of parts which they're very typical for somebody with addiction, where, you know, on the one hand I've got the sort of overindulging parts, right? The sort of bingers, or you know, they just want to take me out and go for it, like wow, you know,
mm-hmm,
whatever. We call them firefighters in
right.
IFS.
Mm-hmm,
And then on the other side, you've got all the managers. So they're the ones that are sort of trying to put the firefighters down and going, well, if you've been doing all the binging, then I've got to do all the exercising or the starving or whatever I do. And they're usually, those managers, they're usually accompanied by very fierce inner critic. And the more the firefighters do their crazy behaviors, the more the inner critic is going to just weigh down on the whole system. So it's a real kind of it's like it gets worse and worse and more extreme. So yeah, inner critics can be so loud, and it's just so violent sometimes, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. That isolation and the inner critic.
Mm,
If you're resonating out there, we
mm.
resonate with that too. So Vanessa, you've got courses on your website?
Yeah, so I've just like recently sort of redone my little website, and I've gone onto a course platform where I can now offer courses. And so I've got my first two courses, which is great. It's so much fun doing them, and they're tiny. Like one of them is an hour long, the other one is 2 hours long, and one of them is called Food Addiction Orientation, which is sort of like a bit of an overview of the whole concept of food addiction, and it helps people to understand, well, what is it, and how can I even diagnose it on myself, and you know, what do I do, how do I get started, what is the science behind it. So just a bit of background, a lot of sort of reading resources as well. And then the other one, it's just a sort of really tiny, simple session on managing emotions and cravings. And it's sort of just a few little tiny tools that you can use to, you know, manage your emotions, manage your cravings. Because what I hear so much from clients is, how do I deal with my feelings? Because it sounds so simple, but you know, we all know how hard it is, and you were just talking about it earlier, you know, like discomfort, like having discomfort is so intolerable. Having any sort of feeling for many of us is really intolerable. How do we deal with those, right?
Mm.
So yeah, those are the courses on the page now, and I'm hoping to develop a little library of courses over the next, you know, months or years, you know, and slowly just develop that. And because I've just launched it, I do have a little what's it called, a coupon. So if you want 30% off the courses, and they're very, very well priced, very reasonably priced anyway, you can use the coupon, which is Discover 30. So that's 30% off.
Mm-hmm. And I'll pop that in the show notes too, with a link to your website.
Great.
And if people want to get in touch with you, Vanessa?
Yeah, easy as well. So you just go to my website, which is vanessakredler.com, and yeah, you can get in touch with me there via my email address. And yeah, look forward to connecting with anyone who'd like to connect.
Thank you, Vanessa. Before we finish up, one last question for you, which you did mention this earlier, but what are you grateful for from your experience with addictions and your turning points?
Yeah, it's a lovely question. I am so grateful for my addiction. Actually, I think it's my purpose, kind of, to kind of be with that and really explore that in my lifetime, and kind of go to the depths of it. Like my whole life is full of dark nights of the soul, and then sort of coming out the other end, and it's almost like it's a spiritual journey, sort of, and it really does. Addiction really keeps you on your toes. Like, you've got to be really onto your shit. Like, you've got to really know what's going on inside. And I'm grateful for that, because I think it keeps you or makes you, and hopefully keeps you, a very integral, kind of clear-cut person, because you've got to be. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that it's given me a lot of purpose for my business, because I really enjoy working with clients who are struggling with that too. And it's almost like, I can bring a lot to that because of the lived experience. And I love it. So I think that's also something that I'm really grateful for. Yeah. So there's a lot to be grateful for.
Yeah, and acknowledging that gift that you've taken on, about from having those dark nights of the soul and actually having to live a life that is fruitful and feels wonderful for yourself, to face that dark night of the soul and do the work and take the commitment to learn how to run your operating system, and then be able to pass that on to others because of your commitment to yourself.
Yeah, nicely said. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you. You've added value to my life today, so I appreciate that,
Thank
Vanessa.
you.
And
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, I'll see you at a Bronte sit sometime soon.
Absolutely. Always. That's right. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
lovely, it's such a lovely community. And it's always with the Bronte sit, I'm always like, every time I go, there's some epiphany, because I've spoken to somebody interesting, or something interesting has happened, or whatever. So yeah, it's a lovely community.
Yeah. Well, I'll pop a link in the show
Mhm.
notes to that as well, in case anybody wants to is in Sydney on a Saturday morning and wants to come have a meditation at Bronte Beach, 6:30 a.m.
Great.
So, well,
Wonderful.
Vanessa, wonderful having you on Beyond Turning Points. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. See ya.